today to bring to you the full audio of my interview with Lucas Middlebrook, the labor attorney who used to work for PFA and now is sort of in the wind when it comes to MMA unionization movement. He also worked for Major League Soccer Referee Association and a few other associations as well in sports. But I wanted to bring to you guys the audio because I know some people don't like reading transcripts of interviews. So here it is. Hope you guys enjoy.
This is Lucas.
Hey, Lucas. This is Matthew Hunter with the Boxing Voice. How you doing?
Hey, Matthew. I'm good. How are you?
Pretty good, pretty good. You know, just a nice brisk morning in California.
Oh, where in California are you?
Los Angeles.
Oh, boy. Yeah, brisk. That's a relative term, huh?
Yeah, it's like 65, you know, like that's nothing.
Yeah, I can't complain. We're not horrible today. We're like just shy of 50, which in December I'll take. So.
Oh, yeah, that's not too bad. That's not too bad. Well, I don't want to waste too much of your time, so let's just get through these questions as fast as possible. I know you're a busy man.
Great.
And just to preface, you know, because we're boxing and we're a little bit outside of the MMA circle, I think a lot of readers and fans of boxing aren't really in tune with what's happening in MMA. It's not really in tune with the unionization movement. So I think like basic background of unionization and what's been happening is good for the readers.
Okay.
So these first couple questions are really basic, and you don't have to get really into too many details. But first question is, what can a union provide for boxers?
A union could provide, let me back up. If you're certified by the National Labor Relations Board, or if you're what they call voluntarily recognized by the employer under the National Labor Relations Act, then that employer, that entity, has a legal obligation to bargain in good faith with the union over terms and conditions of employment. And that's not just a term of art. Bargaining good faith is actually a legal terminology. So it's not enough for an employer to just sit down at the table and go through the motions. That's referred to as surface bargaining. That's illegal. So there's a whole host of items that go into bargaining in good faith. But to take a step forward, and typically what a collective bargaining agreement is going to contain is it's going to contain wages, obviously, or compensation is going to be included. It's going to have comprehensive health care included within, post-employment benefits like potentially a pension or a 401k, a defined contribution plan. Drug testing is a mandatory subject of bargaining, so the procedure, what drugs are tested for, if there's a review process. And then you can have non-mandatory subjects of bargaining included within a CBA as well, such as, could be travel reimbursement, hotel rooms, things along these lines. So it really can solidify the terms and conditions of employment and make it a two-way street as opposed to management simply implementing what they choose to implement.
And can you explain the basic steps, like, steps 1 through 10 or whatever, that athletes need to take in order to form an effective union?
Yeah, so the basic step is you have to essentially assemble an entity, whether it's, you name it, an association or an organization or a union. So the first step is to come up with a name, so to speak, and form an entity, and then the next step, probably the most crucial step, is educating those that may or may not be interested as to what unionism entails, what the process is, what could be negotiated, things along those lines, what protections there are under the applicable federal law, which is the National Labor Relations Act. There are protections against recrimination from employers, from actually organizing, not just being involved in the union, but trying to put one together as well. But probably the most crucial step is, once you get through all of that, is collecting what they refer to as authorization cards. And these are just one-page cards which an individual signs, saying that they authorize that entity to file for a representation petition with the National Labor Relations Board. And if the group is currently unrepresented by a union, then what you have to do is, at a minimum, You have to get 30% of the workforce to sign these cards, and once the NLRB confirms that you've made that requisite showing of interest, they will then call for an election. And once you have an election, essentially everyone who's affected gets to vote yes or no on the union, and the union would need 50% plus one of the votes to then be certified by the National Labor Relations Board.
And you briefly mentioned a trade association, I believe. And now, what's the difference between a union and a trade association, and which one, in your opinion, is better for a combat sport?
Well, as long as the evidence is there that you are in fact statutory employees and not independent contractors, then I believe the union is the most effective route to go, because the difference is that if you're a certified union, then the employer or the management, they have a legal obligation to bargain with you, and if they do not, or if it seems like they're not willing to reach agreement, you can file bad faith bargaining charges with the National Labor Relations Board, and there's quite a bit of oversight from that entity. If you're a trade association, there's no legal obligation for anybody to bargain with you over anything. And if take it a step further, if as a trade association you were to coordinate some sort of concerted withholding of services or a strike, so to speak, if you're not a certified union, you can actually be sued under the Sherman Antitrust Act. Mm-hmm. So if the evidence is there for employee as opposed to independent contractor, I would always advise going the route of the union.
Now, what evidence would there be to, because in my knowledge, boxers are along the lines of, UFC fighters, MMA fighters, they're independent contractors, they're not necessarily employees. So what are the steps to actually prove that they are employees and not independent contractors, if there is proof? What would that proof look like?
Yeah, so it doesn't come down to labels. So even though the UFC and I would imagine some boxing contracts label these individuals as independent contractors, that's not the controlling test. If you were to file authorization cards with the National Labor Relations Board, it would be incumbent upon the management group or the promotion to argue that you're not statutory employees. The burden would actually be on them, not on the union seeking to organize. Yeah. And the NLRB looks at an 11-factor test to determine whether you are in fact employees or independent contractors, and the statute is construed liberally to lean in favor of a finding of employee status. And a lot of what the NLRB looks at is the amount of control that the entity has over the individual. The potential for the individual to secure other employment outside of the other similar employment outside of the entity without there being some restriction. So, you look at, for instance, in the UFC, the fighters are told when to fight, where to fight, what they can wear, what they cannot wear. They're not allowed to fight for any other entity or association. Things along these lines. So there's every bit of indication that under the NLRB they would be found to be employees. And I'm not as familiar with how the boxing world operates. For instance, I don't know if you're boxing for PBC, is that the exclusive promotion that you're allowed to box under during the term of your contract? And that's just an answer I don't know, a question I don't know the answer to at this point. You may.
Now would a exclusive TV network contract, like certain fighters like Sergey Kovalev has an exclusive deal with HBO, he's not allowed to go fight on Showtime or CBS. So could that be construed as the same thing as a constructive contract? That's
interesting. I mean, I guess who is when he gets his paycheck, who is that coming from? Is that coming from HBO?
I do not know that, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, it would come. Yeah, it would really boil down to who's paying these fighters, who's paying the boxers, right? So, who's giving them are they getting a 1099? I would assume they're getting a 1099 when they get their wages as opposed to a W-2. But on the 1099, what entity is responsible for the payment? And then and then work backwards from there, determine what the entity is, and then figure out what control does that entity that's paying the individual have over the boxer, and is it enough control and discretion to make an argument that they are in fact employees and not independent contractors. So, for instance, I mean, not to get too much into the legal ease of this, but it was a 2014 decision by the National Labor Relations Board, which involved Federal Express drivers, which had always been classified as independent contractors, and they went through these 11 factors and found, and this was actually even less control than you see, certainly in the UFC and maybe even with boxing, because these individuals, they leased their own trucks, they were allowed to go work for other entities, but they found that the FedEx still had a significant amount of control for those employees to be declared, those individuals to be declared employees. So, and that was kind of a shift. That was because in that decision, it was always a 10-factor test. Before that, they added the 11th factor, which actually made it easier to produce a finding of employee status. So, the law certainly has gone in that direction. That could certainly change next year once Mr. Trump may have the ability to appoint 3 new members to the National Labor Relations Board.
Yeah, who knows with that, right?
Right.
But you mentioned on Twitter actually earlier today in reference to former UFC strawweight champion Carla Esparza having to sell her Harley motorcycle that she won on The Ultimate Fighter. And you said specifically, we'll take grassroots unionizing led solely by fighters without outside influence, get to the bargaining table and fix the profession. Now, obviously you're talking about MMA here, but I think this can loosely be described or fitted with boxing as well. Now, do you think that a union or association or such can do it without any corporate donorship? Now, I'm not pro-corporate in any way, but, this obviously takes, legal battles and such. Do fighters that are usually underpaid have the money to do this without outside influence? You know what I'm saying?
Oh no, that's a great question, and it maybe requires a twofold answer. Is really the reasoning behind the tweet was that I've seen unfortunately, even in the MMA world, I've seen these drives start and fail because in order to, in my mind, in my experience, in order to succeed, the individuals who are going to be affected by a potential collective bargaining agreement or the union itself need to be the ones making the decisions within the organization. And if you have entities or individuals associated that have ulterior motives, then it could be led astray in the wrong direction. I think it really succeeds when those who are going to be affected are the ones leading the charge and the ones making the decisions. Now, with that said, obviously unions are going to hire professionals, whether it's labor lawyers or down the road labor economists.
Exactly.
So that's they're not going to go to the table without professional representation. But the individuals, the fighters, they should be the ones making those decisions: who to hire, who to fire. Now, in terms of financing, so to speak, if you're a labor union in this country, you're subject to what a statute called the Labor Management Reporting and Disclosure Act, which actually has significantly strict guidelines as to what money can and can't go in of a labor union. From the ground up, for instance, let's say you had an established union, and I always use the Teamsters just because it's a well-known union and they're very large in this country. But if you had a union like the Teamsters that said we'd like to organize the UFC fighters, well, the Teamsters, which has some deep coffers, obviously, could use their money to start an organizing drive. Now, if you didn't want to be affiliated with a larger union, which has its downsides, then really it's got to come from donations from within the group, and that's typically how union organizing drives, especially independent unions, start out. So certainly there's not a lot of money at the forefront until you can start collecting dues. And that's just the reality of the situation. So my firm helped the Major League Soccer officials unionize from the ground up. They didn't have a union on the property. They put together a union. They went through the NLRB process, an election, and they negotiated their first CBA. and they didn't have a lot of money to begin with either, and so we wrote off a substantial amount of legal fees, which probably is not the best business practice, but it's as a labor firm, we believe in the process and getting the representation. But now they're a very successful union, 3 years in, so. And that's a much smaller group. That's only a group of about 76 individuals. So if you got a number of fighters on board, obviously the ones not making as much money couldn't donate as much money to the cause. Maybe it's a very small amount, and maybe it's nothing. But maybe fighters with a little extra money to spare would put in a little to the till just to get the union going. But that's pretty typical of independent unions that start from the ground up. Is they're not going to have money at the beginning, so they're going to do a lot on their own, and hopefully there's individuals or professionals out there who believe in the cause as well and put in some pro bono work up front.
Now, talking about obviously this grassroots movement, does boxing or even MMA or any other combat sport, do they need big name fighters, big name boxers to either donate, to sign on, to be a spokesperson to really make the change? Can it be the undercard guys and only the undercard guys, and then eventually after the union's already formed, you get the big names, or do you need the big names from the onset almost?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's a question I've been asked before. And then there's definitely some individuals out there that think, you got to get the big names on first. And I think from a press coverage and a media perspective, then that certainly helps because that's a story, right?
If you
had a Dante Wilder or you had a Conor McGregor and they were leading the charge, that's a big story. But then in another respect, if you think about it in the inverse, it wouldn't surprise me so much if Conor McGregor did that, because he's at a point where he's got substantial leverage with the UFC just based on who he is and what he's done. And so he's not going to be in as much fear of recrimination as someone who's fighting on an undercard and feels like they could be cut at any time. So I think actually if you were to establish a union and it started out with these undercard fighters and they did a majority of the legwork and they demonstrated to their colleagues that this was a fighter-driven organization, that I feel actually in the long run that would probably be the stronger union platform than to just rely on big name value and press response and flash up front. Like I said, it sells a good story. But remember, the goal is to get a functional union that is going to get on the property, and then once you're in, then you hold an election for an executive board, and at that point, maybe the big name individuals put their name in, like the National Basketball Players Association.
Yeah.
Chris Paul is the president, LeBron James is the first vice president, but it wasn't always like that. For a while, you had middle of the road or tier players serving on the union's board. So I actually think in the long run, it could be more effective to get the individuals who are willing to put in the time, the effort, to construct it from the ground up, and I think that would create a stronger entity going forward.
Now, Paul Gift from Bloody Elbow recently put out an investigative piece on the Golden Boy Al Heyman deposition. Have you seen it by chance?
Oh, I have not.
I'll send you the link. It's pretty fascinating, but and there's an excerpt from it from Michael Ring, who works with PBC, and he basically says that PBC has tried to be like the UFC in a sense, and their goal is for PBC and boxing to end up like a league, like the NFL. And they even said, right here it says, I think it's an ideal model. There's a minimum amount that would be paid to the fighters, and then there's a sharing arrangement like the NFL, is a direct quote from Michael Ring. And I just thought I wanted to get your thoughts on if boxing turns into a league or PBC turns into a league, would that actually be easier to unionize in a sense?
No question. Absolutely. Because then you've got a single entity that you can focus on, that you're going to have a much stronger ability to make an argument that they're employees and not independent contractors, and then once you get in and you do unionize, you're dealing with a single entity management, and And at that point, then you would look to negotiate a revenue split, like you see with most other professional sports, which is typically a 50-50. Except in combat sports, it's not even close to that from everything that I've read.
Yeah, and obviously, we don't have that much information because most of these companies are private corporations. But there are some.
And that's another good point. You're right about that. And then under the National Labor Relations Act, the union has the ability to request all relevant information to the negotiation process or the grievance process, and that doesn't per se include all of the financial information. But if an employer or a management, if they plead poverty at the negotiating table, so if the union makes a proposal for some sort of compensation or revenue sharing package, and the response is we can't afford that, then at that point it triggers your right to have them open up the books.
Interesting. There's some in this boxing industry that say that boxing cannot unionize, that there's no single major promoter at this time. It's too fragmented compared to like MMA, where we have a basic monopoly without calling it that with the UFC. Boxing already has the Ali Act, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I hear this a lot. So in your opinion, do you think boxing, from, maybe not your full knowledge because you're not completely in it like you are in MMA, but do you think boxing will ever get unionized? Because there's some that say it will never get unionized.
I do agree that I think it would be more difficult than the path that's going on with the UFC right now, just because you do have that single entity you can focus on, and it does seem in boxing there's just a number of different promoters and promotions, and what I would be interested in is there a consistency in where these boxers are getting paid from, and but if as you mentioned the sport does move more toward a UFC model or a single entity model, then I don't think that the statement that they'll never unionize would be remotely close to being true. I think if that was the path that the sport would take, then I think that would be the perfect time for the athletes to really get serious about unionizing. And then if an analysis of the present state demonstrated that the legal odds of obtaining employee status and unionizing were not in their favor, I think at a minimum they could put together some sort of boxers association and get individuals included in the association. They wouldn't be able to negotiate for anything up front, but at least you're now building the solidarity that you would need at some point to maybe turn into a union. And there's also other things you could do as an association. You could pool your money, and you could go to an insurance broker and try, depending on the number of people that are involved, get better deals on medical insurance. And things of that nature. So, an association would help on the front end, and then once you've built the trust in that association, if there were a path to unionize, then you'd already done all of that legwork, and it would be a much quicker path than you see the MMA fighters are struggling with right now. Yeah.
Now, you spent your entire adult life that I know of striving for athletes and sports people to get their rights. I've researched you. I followed your career in a sense. I remember you defending Nick Diaz in front of Nevada. I thought that was, a hallmark moment of MMA. But there are people that really downplay unionization and unions in combat sports because they believe that there's not enough financial stability and surplus, basically, to not water down the consumer product. Compared to like the NFL, NBA, and such, that the money is not there in a sense to give these fighters 50% and still continue to have a A-level product that the consumer wants to watch. What do you have to say to that?
I would disagree, because the money, it's not as if it's going to take additional money to make that happen. It just means that the people at the top of the UFC are not going to be getting as much of the revenue. So the new ownership group would not be making as high of profits to line their pockets. It's the money would just be shifting directions from the very few at the top, taking away all of the hundreds of millions of dollars, a spreading or an equaling of that money over the fighters. And I actually think it would result in a better product in the long run, because you're going to have fighters who now are currently struggling and may actually be working 2 or 3 different jobs, and in some cases actually paying to fight in the UFC once they pay their trainers and their gym fees and their coaches. And you're making 10 and 10, and if you lose, you're coming away with 10 before taxes. So I think if you had a workforce of fighters who didn't have to worry about where that next paycheck was coming from, or whether they were going to have health care or a post-employment retirement benefit, that you're going to actually have a better athletic product that you will put in front of the fans, and at that point the UFC will start bringing in more money, and everyone will prosper from it. So I think in the long run it will create more stability within the sport than what we see right now.
Yeah, especially since Paul Gift also did a really great piece. I think it was Paul Gift that really analyzed all of Nevada's, California's, and I believe New Jersey's commission reports on purses, and how and then he compared MMAs and boxers, and how boxers made significantly less money than MMA fighters. And we have this huge movement in MMA to unionize and get wages up, because it's so bad right now. And then when you look at boxing, it's even worse. So, there's definitely needs to be something that has to be done, I think, in combat sports. Now, there's going to be boxers that read this that probably have no idea what's really been going on, and not really understand everything. So what do you have to tell them that what's the next step for them, basically? What is, if there's a boxer reading this right now that's interested in unionization, what do you think he or she should do?
I would say that the first step of someone who's potentially interested is to learn more about the process of becoming unionized, and if you do become unionized, the bargaining process and what that could mean, and the protections that are involved. Because the more that I talked to UFC fighters who didn't really understand the process, and that's not surprising. I mean, there's a lot of, most of this country doesn't understand the unionizing process. It's not, this country is not as heavily unionized as people think, and the union numbers have been dropping over the years. So that's the first step, because I realized in talking to the UFC fighters that once they understood the process and what the bargaining situation entailed and the legal levers you could pull, they seemed to become more and more comfortable with the concept and the idea. So I would say, educating yourself is the first step. And my email address is online, and I would welcome anyone, if they're interested, to shoot me an email. And I've taken my own time to talk with a lot of UFC fighters, and I would certainly pick up the phone and talk to anyone who had some questions.
Well, thank you so much, Lucas, for taking the time every day to talk to me. This has been a great interview, and I can't wait to talk to you again.
Thank you, Matthew. I look forward to reading your piece.
All right. Have a good one.
Take care.
And that concludes our interview with Lucas Middlebrook. I hope you guys enjoyed it. And I will have a few articles out later this week detailing my views on what transpired between me and Lucas, what was said, what was talked about, and how that correlates with what I know has been happening in the boxing community. That's really a few years behind, maybe 3 or 4 years behind the MMA unionization movement. So it's a lot to look forward to, a lot of changes happening to this sport. All we can do is hope for the best. And we have a bunch of fights on this weekend. Be sure to follow my work at theboxingvoice.com. Follow our Instagram, Twitter, all that stuff at The Boxing Voice. And you will see we already have a ton of radio shows and podcasts out breaking down the Terrence Crawford, John Molina fight, Anthony Joshua, Eric Molina fight, so forth and so forth. So hope you guys enjoy the interview, and we'll see you guys soon.